Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LEC Spring Playoffs Lower Bracket Round 1 and 2 overview and analysis video. In today's video, we're going to be going over the 3 series we got this past weekend. So, Lower Bracket Round number 1, the 2 teams that were the 5 and 6 seeds taking on the 2 teams that lost from Upper Bracket Round 1, and then those 2 teams, the winners of those 2 series, facing off against each other in Round 2 to see who moves on to the semifinals. Of course, we covered the 3 first series that happened in the upper bracket of the playoffs last week. You can check out that video on this channel, but today we're going to be going over the lower bracket in round 1 and 2, and we'll know our top 3 by the end of this video. We're going to know our first 2 teams to officially be eliminated from the playoffs, which is always very exciting, as well as our semifinals, our lower bracket finals, like I've talked about. So without further ado, let's get into it. If you're excited, first of all, let me know down in the comment section below. Always curious to know your thoughts and opinions down there. If my voice does sound a little bit raspy, it's because I just got done, basically as I'm recording this, casting the Anyone's Legend Weibo Gaming Best of 5 in the LPL playoffs. You can check out, obviously, all my LPL English casts down in the comment section below. It's been awesome to be able to actually commentate officially, I guess unofficially technically, but for the main LPL English broadcast. It's been a lot of fun. I'm done for the split now, but again, if my voice sounds a little bit raspy, that's why. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get into the content. If you are new here, what we're going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each series that we cover, and at the end of the video, we'll be updating the bracket. Again, there's only going to be 3 teams remaining in the playoffs. One team, G2 Esports, has already qualified not only for the LEC finals, but of course for MSI. Who will be joining them will be determined by Movistar Koi taking on the winner of the, I guess, gauntlet that we have today to talk about. So let's get into the actual analysis and talk about how these teams are going to get there. Of course, you know, we're going series by series, and that means starting with the round 1 matchups, and these were more obvious on paper, but it's always interesting to see if any of these teams can pull off an upset. The first one we got has become a little bit of a rivalry here in the LEC. It's the number 2 seeded Fnatic taking on the number 5 seeded GIANTX. And Fnatic is going to pick up the 3-1 series win. They're not going to struggle too much with GIANTX, nor should they struggle too much with GIANTX. We've always talked about it being a big 4 right now in the LEC, and as much as I think you could make the argument that GX is the best team outside of that top 4, it's really difficult to break through that top 4. Credit to GX, though, they're able to take game number 3. I think that there were some back and forth moments throughout other parts of this series. It just didn't really end up working out for them. Fnatic was better. They executed better in terms of their setups and in terms of the way they wanted to play the game, and that means that they are sitting there and moving on now to round number 2. It would have been a disaster if they were not. So we can go ahead and talk about it here. Player of the series for me is going to go to Upset in the bot lane. Of course, as a reminder, Fnatic is down here because they had to take on G2 in round number 1, which was not an ideal draw. I guess it technically wasn't a draw. Corp ended up choosing Movistar Koi to go into. Obviously, that didn't work out for them either, but Fnatic had to play G2. They couldn't quite overcome the Kings of Europe, and so they dropped to the lower bracket. But I think that there is reason to believe that that was just unlucky. G2 is probably the best team in the LEC right now. They kind of proved that by getting to the finals, by qualifying for MSI already, but you know, Fnatic still has a lot going for them, and I think their upside was definitely still here, and their upside comes through Upset, who, like I said, is going to get player of the series. The consistency that he offers is tremendous. People were really upset that I did not make him my All-Pro. He ends up getting the MVP vote for the actual LEC broadcast. I think that there is some, you know, validity to that. I could understand kind of going to that. Upset was really good this split. He's been really good across this entire year. He's easily been one of the top 280 carries in the LEC alongside Kalist in terms of just actual production, but my concern with Upset has always just been, okay, your KDAs are really good, but like when you watch the games, there just aren't a lot of games where I'm like, you're the player who won this game. Oftentimes, Upset is a really good KDA while somebody else creates a lot for the rest of the team. It's why he only got 1 player of the series or player of the game across this entire split. I guess player of the series. I didn't give player of the games because we did best of 3s, but you know what I mean. There's a reason that he wasn't the first player I pointed out in a lot of series. This was not the case. Today was not an example of that. He absolutely was the best player on the Rift, and I think, you know, kind of justified Fnatic's decision to get rid of Noah and Jun in the bot lane. I love Noah and Jun. I think you can make an argument they're a top 3 bot lane in the LEC, and in fact, I might make that argument. I might, you know, say that they're right up there with Supa and Alvaro for 3 or 4, because I think Fnatic and, of course, Corp have 1 and 2, at least in terms of current production. Shout out G2. I don't think that they're a top 4 bot lane. People are going to get mad about that in the comments, but, you know, this kind of proves that getting rid of Noah and moving moving on to Upset, was probably the right move. As much as I like Noah, Upset has absolutely been better, and I think he kind of reassured that here. I think most notably the Xayah game in Game 4 is really the one that cemented him. It was the best game of the series. The Kalista game, though, in Game number 1 was also very, very solid from Upset. When you want him to play aggressive early, he's really good in that role. He's also a very stable late game carry. I've always talked about him as like a slightly better version of Teddy over in the LCK, and I think that that is a pretty accurate way to describe what Upset has been for this team. Now, he wasn't the only player who played well. In fact, I would argue that most of the team ended up playing well in this series. Humanoid actually was really good. I know I'm kind of a Humanoid hater on this channel. I think partially justified, but mostly going to call him out for that Game 2 on the Aurelion Soul. Aesol is one of those champs that, it does really well in a game, and everyone's like, oh, why is this champ not picked more, before realizing that it has no agency pre-20 minutes, and then, the enemy team has to kind of troll in order for it to be as successful. That was kind of the case here. If you're not the better team, Aesol does kind of look bad, but everybody in the comments is going to be like, why does Aesol only pop up every so often? It's because you can't really consistently control the tempo of the game with it. If the team allows it to get fed, it's going to destroy. It just kind of is the way that it is, but Humanoid definitely better than Jackie's in terms of what he was able to set up in this series. Mickey X was once again phenomenal in the support position. He is the best player on Fnatic. I know Upset just won MVP, even if I definitely disagree with that. Mickey is the best and most important player on Fnatic. When he succeeds, the rest of this team succeeds. He's been sensational in 2025, and Oscar Renan definitely had a better series here than he did in round 1, where he got toasted by G2 Esports. It was not even a remotely competitive series, one of the worst that Oscar's ever had. Nice to see him come back down here to the lower bracket, and even though Lot actually has a couple of big moments, Lot was probably the player of the game in Game 3 when he was on the Yorick and GX was able to win. Even with that, Oscar's still incredibly solid. Now, the only player I really have complaints about is Razork in this series. I actually don't think Razork was particularly good. I think he made a myriad of mistakes throughout these 4 games. I just think they were covered up by the fact that his laners were just constantly winning. Upset was in a dominant position in a majority of games. Of course, Mickey X kind of moving around the map and facilitating everything else. Humanoid was great in Game 2. Oscar was super consistent, especially on the tanks throughout this series, and so it just didn't really matter that Razork had some inconsistencies, but once again, Razork has just not been a good playoff performer for Fnatic, and that kind of carried over, even if I don't want to harp on the point too much. So nice win for Fnatic. And then for GIANTX on the other side, it's just a pretty easy conversation. They don't really have the talent to compete with a team that's in the top 5 in a best of 5, right? Like, you can be a competitive team and be interesting. Noah and Jun, I think, are a very good bot lane, even if they didn't get a chance to show that in this series, but just not have enough firepower to really cement yourself in the upper echelon. That's kind of what happened here. Isma's going to get dud of the series. I think there are some conversations in the LEC that just get completely out of control. I'm never going to sit here and say that Isma is a horrible person or, send all these death threats that he is getting right now. It's been very vocal, the negativity towards Isma. I think that kind of shit is just absolutely ridiculous and has no place in the league community, at least from my perspective. I also think that there are some takes out there that kind of relate some of his problems to draft that I don't agree with, or talk about how stupid it is for Isma to keep getting jobs. I think that there is some upside to him as a player. He's just never been able to unlock it regularly. Pretending like he has no good moments, I think, is completely disingenuous to who he is as a player, but I am going to say that those good moments are becoming fewer and far between because it's just not happening consistently. I like things like Pantheon and Nidalee for this team because he has to win early, but when it doesn't work, it really ends up not working. LEC fans, I tweeted this out basically right before recording this video, but LEC fans love to talk about Nocturne Orianna as if it's some unwinnable combo, when really in reality, it's just Europe that can't play it. Like, every other region has found a ton of success playing Nocturne Orianna, but Europe has been so bad at it for so many years for a lot of different reasons. But, these champions have been so unsuccessful specifically for LEC teams that they've just assumed that those champions are bad globally, which is obviously not the case. But as we know, shout out you LEC fans, a majority of you I know don't watch a lot of the other regions. That's not a negative. Most people shouldn't watch more than one region. I'm a psychopath. It's just something worth noting. And then obviously it's worth pointing out that Noah and Jun were definitely the weaker of these two bot lanes. Upset completely gapped Noah, especially in Game 4 when you watch the Xayah into the Misfortune. That's where it really felt the most direct. Jun did not have a particularly good series. He was very good on the Rumble in Game 3, the Rumble support. People are talking about it as if it's some new pick when Life was playing this like 4 times a week last year in the LPL and the LCK and, things like that. So, I think people just forgot that Rumble support exists. This thing has been, on the board for quite a while, but Overall, GX just didn't have the firepower. Lot was really the best player on this team, mostly for that game 3 on Yorick, where they actually did play towards side lanes quite successfully, something a lot of teams don't actually do. But outside of that, like, Jackie's was not as good as Humanoid. You know, we already talked about Isma in the bot lane losing. It's just what happens when you go up against a top-tier team. Fnatic was better, and they proved that. GIANTX's split is over. They don't get that extra life because they were immediately slotted into lower bracket, but I do think they put up a good fight, and depending on what happens in the series we're going to talk about next, there is a very real shot that they end a second split in a row in 5th place, which is really not that bad considering there is a top 4 in the LEC. If you can consistently be the best team outside of that upper echelon, who knows? Maybe one of those teams underperforms down the stretch and you can sneak yourself in, but right now Fnatic is absolutely better, and even with all of their flaws and all the things I don't really like about this team and the way they play best of 5s, they're still definitely good enough to be able to kind of get over the hump here, get over GX, and move on to round 2. Then moving on to our second of the round 1 series here, and this one was even less close on paper. We'll see if that's the case in terms of execution. It was the number 1 seeded K-Corp taking on the number 6 seeded Team Heretics, and K-Corp is going to pick up the 3-1 series win. So a pair of 3-1 series here to close out the lower bracket round number 1, and of course both outcomes going as anticipated. I think if there were any upsets in this stage, things would have gotten very crazy very fast, but luckily for Fnatic and for K-Corp, they do not fall here. It means both of them will meet in the series that we talk about later on in the video, you know, next in the video. But for Heretics, I think they put up a pretty good fight in this series. I certainly think that there are some positives to take away from this series and from this split in general. Heretics being in the playoffs is already such an overperformance, I think, of expectations. Me and basically every other analyst had them at number 10 going into the year, or at the very least around number 10 going into the year, because their floor was just so low with so many young players that had yet to really prove themselves. But they get to top 6, they get into the playoffs, they take a game off of the number 1 seed here in the playoffs, and there are some individual performances that I think are worth praising, but K-Corp at the end of the day are absolutely better, and that means that they're going to be moving on to the next round. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series is very obviously going to go to Kana in the top lane. I don't really have to go over this in any way. Like, games 1 and 4 were, I don't want to say solo won by Kana. Game 1 certainly was. Like, there was no conversation. That was a Korean Jace, and there's a reason that this champion is permabanned against K-Corp. You cannot allow Kana on Jace. He's just going to completely destroy the game, and he's going to blow open your base, and that's exactly what happened in that first game, and then he was super relevant down the stretch as well. Nice game from him in game 3 on the Mbessa, a couple of really nice team fights, and he was incredible in game 4 on the Scion. Really opened up that entire map, and honestly was probably the best player in that game on the Scion. So credit to Kana. He was my MVP pick for the regular season, and honestly, the more I watch him, the more I feel justified. This guy is playing like the best player in the LEC right now. In terms of form, in terms of value added to his individual team, K-Corp was the number 1 team in the regular season, and I think you can point to so many of their wins coming from Kana just absolutely destroying somebody on the top side. Not even necessarily Carlson in this case, because, you know, Carlson was fine. He was probably the best or second best player on Team Heretics in this series. It just did not matter. Kana is better than everybody else that he's going into, and that's why I feel justified with him as my MVP pick. And then for the rest of the team, some positives, some negatives. Targamas was unkillable in the back half of this series. How many engages do you have to do onto the Leona before you realize that that champion is just not going to die in game number 4? Really fun to watch. Again, Targamas' progression from, you know, basically even where he was on Giants and then on G2 and then XL, all of that time, even K-Corp last year where he was a disaster to now, is just unbelievable. It's the best he's ever played in his entire career. Kaliste was genuinely undealable with in game number 3 on the Senna. People always talk, and LEC fans, again, like, maybe I'm being a little bit too harsh, and if I am, you're gonna yell at me in the comments, and that's totally fine. I'm happy to be yelled at if you guys think I'm being wrong or being harsh or generalizing LEC fans, but I see a lot of LEC fans that just complain about champions being super weak all the time. It just feels like LEC fans like generally feel that there are certain picks that are unwinnable, quote unquote, which I don't necessarily agree with. Senna has been one of the champions, you know, Misfortune, we already talked about Nocturne, you know, being one of those champions. There are so many, but Senna is definitely near the top of that list in terms of champions that LEC fans just do not think is playable. I can't understand it. Like, it's the same thing with the Misfortune. Like, I don't really understand. Jhin is another one. Like, why do you think this champion is unplayable? Because they don't do a ton of damage up front. They're not a hyper carry. It's not Zeri or, you know, Jinx or whatever, so it's bad. Like, I just don't really understand why people don't think this champion is strong. If she gets to her late game stacks, she's utterly dominant. And quite frankly, it's really difficult to stop her getting there. It's why she's seen a rise in popularity in a lot of other regions as well. So yeah, Senna's really good, and Kaliste showed that off in game number 3, even if Fnatic had a pretty good series, all things considered. But outside of that, like, the rest of the team just kind of doing their jobs. Yike was awful in game 2 and was excellent across games 1, 3, and 4, specifically as a facilitator, never really needed to be a carry. And Vladi was also really solid. People got really mad at me that I didn't give Vladi first team All-Pro. Once again, I think he's good. I don't think he's been all that relevant to K-Corp's success throughout this split. I think he's done a good job of stabilizing in the mid lane, and he has definitely, been a top 2 mid laner in terms of, actual gameplay. But in terms of added value, added wins, it's not really where Vladi ends up shining because the rest of his team takes more of a priority. But Camelou is a pretty disastrous laner, and so it ends up being pretty easy for him to sneak by. Again, I'm not trying to say anything negative about Vladi. He's a top 2 mid laner only behind Caps for me in terms of my rankings. I just think from an all-pro conversation, I didn't really see first team all-pro for him. But that's K-Corp. Again, I've kind of talked about this team a lot, so we'll move on to Heretics now and talk about the good first, because Karlsson has just continued to progress and progress and progress. He's honestly been really fun to watch. The player that he reminds me the most of is a very young Irrelevant. I say young, but like the Misfits version of Irrelevant from a couple of years ago, where, he started off as being a really good weak side player, but kind of transitioned into being somebody that I think could do a lot more for the team. That's already happened for Karlsson. It took longer for Irrelevant to make that transition. The problem for him is that he's a very particular player. He's a bad laner. Like, for the LEC standards, like, he is not a good 1v1 top lane player, and especially with lane swaps being a little bit less prevalent, or at least a little bit less forced at the current moment, that's more important than it's ever been. He's a phenomenal team fighter. Like, this guy is actually just min-maxed into team fighting. He reminds me a lot of Rich in the LCK, or obviously formerly of the LCS and formerly of the LPL. He's played in basically every region except for this one. Like, Karlsson reminds me a lot of how Rich plays as a player, and I think he could have a similar effect to what Rich was specifically on Dignitas over in North America, because I think comparable league, quality, and I think Karlsson's skill set does translate to being useful in the late game. If he can even become an average laner at this level, he's going to become a lot more valuable as a player. Right now, he's sacrificing a ton of gold in the early game in order to just stay alive to get to the part of the game he's good at. He needs to get a little bit better in that regard. And then Flakid's the other player that I think was really good this series. I'm a big Flakid Glazer. I've said this for a while, or at least defender, maybe not Glazer, because I don't think he's like a top 3 or top 4 guy, but I think he's absolutely top 6. I would take a guy like Flakid over someone like Karzi. I've made that very clear on this channel. I don't think he gets enough credit, and honestly, he was pretty good in this series. The Misfortune in particular was really good in game number 2, so credit to Flakid. Stend was very aggressive. Oftentimes, it did not end up working out, especially on the Seraphine in game 4, and then Sheo is going to get my dud of the series, mostly because I think that Sejuani ultimate hit me as I was watching the game. That's how wide off a lot of those ultimates were in game number 4, but there were other positive moments. He was pretty good on the Vi in game number 2, just kind of in the face of Yike throughout the entire game. The Neferi and the Lilia did not work. The more he was on carries, the less this team actually had some consistency in the Sejuani, a champion that he's found a ton of success on over the course of not only his career, but this year in particular, not really all that great. And we already talked about it. Camelou's just not a good player. Like, he's certainly not a good laner, and so, being in the playoffs is already a big positive for him. He's been the weak link of this team. Him losing to Vladi is not particularly surprising, but it's nice for Heretics to be here. Again, the shock is not that they got, defeated in their first series and that they're eliminated, but rather that they were here in the first place. That's already going to be considered such a positive for them. And then for K-Corp, still sunshine and rainbows, at least for now. I still believe in this team as a top 2 team. We're going to talk about that as we continue to go forward. Obviously, they still need to be able to pick up the wins that matter, but I said this after their loss to Movistar Koi last week. I don't think K-Corp is worse than Movistar Koi. I think they just underestimated them in round number 1. They kind of made up for their mistake in this series and got themselves in a position where they could be meeting them as long as they win the next series. But that's going to bring us to our second round series to see if either of these teams can keep themselves alive. One of these teams is guaranteed to be eliminated by this series. The other one moves on to lower bracket finals. It's a matchup between the number 2 seeded Fnatic and the number 1 seeded K-Corp. And K-Corp is going to pick up the victory, and they're not just going to win the series, they are going to decimate Fnatic. This was not even remotely close. Game 1 was absolutely the only game in the series with anything going for Fnatic, where you could even look at some of their plays and see some positives, but outside of that, there is just nothing to talk about. Every single player on this team getting outplayed, but specifically the core of this team just getting embarrassed of Razork and Humanoid not showing up here today. gameplay. We will talk about that. For K-Corp on the other side, this is the return to form that I think we were all waiting for from this team. I said it last week. I will continue to say it this week. I believe that this team is going to go to MSI, that they will go to the finals, and that they have a very real shot of winning the finals in the LEC, regardless of the fact that they lost to Movistar Koi in round number 1. Of course, no spoilers for my semifinals predictions that I will do later on at the end of the video, but K-Corp definitely a favorite for that, and it's because I think at their best, they are the best team in the league. When they play their brand of League of Legends, they're better than anybody else's like best brand of League of Legends. It's just about getting that version of them out on a game-to-game basis. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series for me is going to go to Yike. In the jungle, didn't have to think about this at all. This was a masterclass from Yike. If there is one game that you can look at and be like, he was pretty good, it's game 3. And even then, the Maokai was gigantically influential. That game was over by 10 minutes, and a lot of that had to do with Yike. But game 1 and game 2, he obliterated Fnatic. It was not even remotely close. The Wukong was incredible. The Xin Zhao was also very, very good. So credit to Yike for stepping up when it really matters. Obviously, he's had a ton of success individually against Fnatic. And against Razork, this has always been a pretty good matchup for Yike as a player, and that definitely carried over here. The other players to shout out, of course, I guess everybody on K-Corp, but Kana continuing to just be an absolute nuisance on the top side of the map. You can't give him Jace. Why do we keep giving this guy Jace like we did in game number 1? It just feels like every single game that Kana ends up, in a position where he can carry, he does. Like, if given the option to carry, he will succeed, like 100% of the time. It's absolutely insane how good this guy is. I still can't believe it wasn't more of a widespread opinion for this guy to be the MVP of the league, because I just don't know what else there is to see. Like, he's really been that good. Even in their losses, he's really been that good. And then Vladi's the other player that I really want to shout out. Again, sometimes it feels like I have to be a bit low on Vladi because I think the community sometimes just goes a bit overboard on him as a player. I think he's incredibly good, and I certainly think, again, he's a top 2 player, probably around an A-, like in terms of like player grades, which I think is really good. Again, if you go back to my chart, like that would put him in the top 5 to 7 players in the LEC, which I think is a pretty fair place for Vladi to end up being. I think sometimes people can say that, they can put him in the top 1 or top 2 or top 3, and that's where I start to get a little bit more finicky in terms of where Vladi falls, and I hate kind of being the person to push back on a young player who really is emerging, a player who really had not a ton of hype coming into the LEC. For him to be as good as he is incredible, but the comparison I give to him that people don't really like because of the modern implications is I think he's like a slightly souped up version of what like Prime Larson was for Rogue when that team was making the quarterfinals of Worlds and, winning the LEC. Like, I think Vladi is very similar in terms of role to what Larson was, in that he's just hyper stable and hyper consistent. You don't really need to invest a ton into him in order for him to do well. He's very good in the 1v1, which Larson wasn't always, but he's also great as a team fighter, and that's what Larson was. So I think that that's a pretty apt comparison, at least in my brain. That's how I kind of view Vladi as like the best version of Larson, maybe even a little bit better than that. And I hope that gives some indication as to where I rank him as a player. But he destroyed Humanoid, who had a miserable series on the other side. That had more to do with Humanoid and less to do with Vladi, but again, he still played really well here. Kalista and Targamas are incredible. Again, in terms of production, you could argue they are the best bot lane in Europe. I think Upset and Mickey are really the only other two that are going to be in that conversation in the same vein, but Kalista and Targamas completely outplayed them in this series, so it's just K-Corp proving that they really are the #1 team, at least in terms of their regular season performances, that was not a fluke. Because again, this was not even a close series. This was a complete destruction of the #2 seed from the regular season. And for Fnatic on the other side, like, it's weird because everybody has kind of caught up to realize that this Razork humanoid experiment has failed. Please go watch my videos from 2022. Like, I hate doing like these ridiculous victory laps, but 4 years ago, I was sitting in this chair and I was talking about how it's weird. Razork and humanoid are good players, but they just have like negative chemistry. I said that in 2022 on this channel. Again, I have so many videos where I talk about that super regularly from 3.5, 4 years ago, and yet we're still sitting here in the Razork humanoid experiment, and now everyone's caught up. Now everyone's like, yeah, this experiment failed, you gotta move on. I've been saying this for almost half a decade at this point. Like, genuinely, it's cool to know that I was kind of ahead of the curve and talking about how this would never work. It's super sad to know that Fnatic had to learn the hard way that this was just not going to work as a duo, because they're not not playoff performers. Now, that's not always the case. Humanoid was a player who, previously had stepped up in the playoffs. When you're talking about 2022 or 2023, he was bad in the regular season and then got good in the playoffs when it really mattered. That's not always been the case for Humanoid. It's certainly not the case right now, but this team has an inherent ceiling because look at these performances. Who do you want to give dud of the series to? Whoever you want, man. Razork or Huma. It has to go to one of those two, but both of them were horrendous. I'm giving it to Humanoid. I think he was slightly worse, mostly because I think Yike was better in terms of the jungle matchup, and Razork kind of got pushed off of his consistent piece, but Humanoid had the worst game of this series, which was game 1 on the Victor. Completely unplayable from him. Not only did Yike completely blow him up on the Wukong, Kana made his life miserable. Vladdy made his life miserable on the Hui. Just really awful stuff from Humanoid. He was miserable in games 2 and 3 as well. But Razork really took the cake in game 2 on the Skarner, where things just went from bad to absolutely worse. Neither of these guys played even remotely passable. These didn't look like players that were near top 4 in terms of their production, and they were the ones who held the team back here. Oscar Renan was obviously worse than Kana because he's not as good of a player as Kana is, but Oscar wasn't the fault in this series. Upset and Mickey were generally fine, but how much can you do as a bot lane? And even then, it's not like they were winning early in the 2v2. Kaliste was playing Draven and Lucian and Misfortune, and Upset was just trying to scale into the late game on things like Xayah, and that wasn't necessarily working out. When your mid-jungle duo gets obliterated in the way that Fnatic did in this series, it's unwinnable, and at some point you have to pull the plug on this experiment. Fnatic needs to move on from these two. I don't think it will happen mid-year. I think they will run them back and run this 5 back for summer, and then I think in the offseason, it's time to make those changes. And for K-Corp, congratulations. You're moving on to top 3. Fnatic is now out in 4th place. Nobody should be surprised by that, by the way. This is the exact outcome that Fnatic could have predicted, not only going into this weekend, obviously, but going into the playoffs because they are playoff underperformers. It's just who this team is at this point, but K-Corp getting into the top 3 is where they should have been all along. They probably shouldn't be dropping to the lower bracket in round 1, so they're going to get the chance to get their revenge on Movistar Koi, and I think there's pretty good reason to believe that it might go different this time around. All right, but that is going to do it for my LEC lower bracket round number 1 and 2 overview and analysis video. Up on the screen, the updated bracket, and we are down to our final 3. G2 already having secured their spot in the finals and having a spot at MSI because of their win in winners finals. They will be joined by whoever wins the semifinals matchup. Movistar Koi, of course, coming down from winners finals, and K-Corp earning their spot today, as we talked about in the video. Again, the winner of that will move on to take on G2, but will also qualify themselves for an international tournament, and to me, this is a super intriguing matchup. Of course, their first matchup was super close already, but Koi was definitely better. It was a 3-2. It went the full distance. It went all 5 games, but I think you could argue that Koi's wins were super dominant and K-Corp's wins were pretty shaky at best, and so you're kind of looking at a situation where Koi, at least in terms of modern form, would be considered favorites. I just don't think that's going to be the case. Like I said previously at the end of the K-Corp Fnatic segment, I really do believe that K-Corp just did not take that series as seriously as maybe they should have, and I think they're going to be better this time around. I think they're going to be able to take it, and I honestly don't think they're going to struggle all that much. Maybe Jojo Pune overperforms and, smashes my expectations. Supa and Alvaro were unreal in that first series, and, so was everybody. Like Mirwin and Elyoya were also very good for Koi, but at the end of the day, when I go down the line, I think K-Corp is better, and I'm going to stick to my guns. My prediction is K-Corp 3-1. They will be moving on to the finals. Of course, that will be its own separate video, and we're done with the series by series section of the LEC. The next time you see a video pop up, it will be that semifinal series, and it will be a game-by-game breakdown, so get excited for that. But that's gonna do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we're going to be covering the semifinals and finals in depth, game by game on this channel in their own separate videos, but we're covering all 3 of the other major regions in the playoffs as well. So LTA North, LCK, and LPL. Of course, we're also covering the NACL Tier 2 over in North America. So if you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, especially as we make our way to MSI, this is the place forward. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all